Good morning, students. In today's lecture, we would be discussing about two paired cranial venous sinuses, that is the transverse sinuses and the sigmoid sinuses in detail. In previous lectures, we had talked about the cavernous sinuses and also about the unpaired cranial venous sinuses. So today we will talk about transverse and sigmoid sinuses. So the transverse sinuses, you can see here in the figure, these are the transverse sinuses, named so because of the direction in which they are placed. They are large sinuses, right is usually larger than the left, situated in the posterior part of the attached margin of tentorium cerebelli. So in this figure you can see here, this is tentorium cerebelli. This is a fold of dura mater like the falx cerebri, and these are transverse sinuses in the posterior attached part of this tentorium cerebelli. The right side transverse sinus is continuation of the superior sagittal and the left side sinus is continuation of the straight sinus. It extends from the internal occipital protuberance to the posterior inferior part of the parietal bone at the base of the mastoid process. Mastoid process is the prominent bone which is located behind the ear. So it extends up to that. It bends and becomes the sigmoid sinus. So it starts from the internal occipital protuberance. It runs along the posterior inferior angle of the parietal bone at the base of the mastoid process, and then it goes down and becomes the sigmoid sinus. The same can be seen in the figure. The tributaries of the transverse sinuses are the superior petrosal sinus, inferior cerebral veins, inferior cerebellar veins, the diploic vein or the inferior anastomotic vein. The next are the sigmoid sinuses. So anything that is S-shaped, whether it's a curve or a sinus, is named as sigmoid. So these sinuses have been given the name because of their shape. They are also located on the right and the left side, and they are direct continuation of the transverse sinus. This is transverse sinus. It goes down and becomes the sigmoid sinus. It extends from the point where the transverse sinus ends. So it will begin from the posterior inferior angle of the parietal bone, and it will go up to the posterior part of the jugular foramen. This is the jugular foramen. And when the sigmoid sinus reaches the jugular foramen, it becomes the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein. So the end of the sigmoid sinus is the beginning of the internal jugular vein. So this jugular foramen here is very important because it contains important structures. It is opening at the base of the skull. The size, it is located both on the right and the left side. The right side foramen could be larger in size than the left. And the entire foramen is divided into three compartments, that is the anterior, the intermediate and the posterior compartment. The anterior compartment would contain the inferior petrosal sinus. The posterior compartment contains the superior bulb of the internal jugular vein, and in between there are three important cranial nerves, that is the 9th, 10th and the 11th cranial nerve, which are the glossopharyngeal, vagus and spinal accessory. So if there is any obstruction in this foramen, it leads to severe clinical manifestations, and they are referred to as jugular foramen syndrome. Important feature is this sinus, it grooves the mastoid part of the temporal bone. It is separated anteriorly from the mastoid antrum and the mastoid hair cells with the help of a thin plate of bone. So the sigmoid sinus has important relation. It is related with the middle ear as well as to the mastoid hair cells and mastoid antrum, and there is only a thin bone to separate these two. The tributaries are the mastoid and the condylar emissary veins, the cerebellar veins, and the internal auditory vein, because it is related to the ear, and also it shares the location with the internal auditory meatus, so it has veins from those areas named accordingly. The clinical anatomy related with the sigmoid sinus, the thrombosis of the sigmoid sinus is, it takes place always secondary to infection in the middle ear, which is known as otitis media, or because of infection in the mastoid process, which is known as mastoiditis. So if there is otitis media or if there is mastoiditis, as a complication, this infection, if not treated at proper time, can spread to the sigmoid sinus and lead to thrombosis in these sinus. Also, the infection from the sigmoid sinus can spread to the transverse sinus because it is related, and also from the transverse it can spread to the superior sagittal sinus. This, if more than one sinus is involved, it can lead to impairment in the CSF drainage. The drainage of the cerebrospinal fluid may get affected, and it can lead to development of a condition which is known as hydrocephalus, and because it is associated with ear infection, it is known as otitic hydrocephalus. So the relations of the sigmoid sinus makes it clinically very significant, as it is related with the middle ear and the mastoid process. Infections from there can reach this sinus, and from this sinus to the other intercommunicating sinuses, and they can lead to different complications. So that's all about the transverse and the sigmoid sinuses. Thank you so much.